Welcome to Sinister Heroes. I'm your host, Danny Iniquitous. Thank you for tuning in. If you're new to the channel, this is a channel about Dungeons and Dragons where we try and take a darker tone with everything we do here. So if you like edgier kind of content, definitely hit that like and subscribe button. A big thank you to our Patreon supporters. We love you guys. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. What you do for us is absolutely amazing, and we're very grateful to have you helping us keep this going. If you're interested in becoming a Patreon supporter, the link is in the description, as well as the link to a live stream game that we're a part of on critical failures. Check us out. It's Wednesdays, it's 9:30, and all the videos are added the next day also. So check us out, catch up, and definitely get involved. With all that out of the way, we're going to jump into this week's video, a topic of something that I absolutely dislike. We're going to talk about gnomes. Okay. Gnomes, they are a cornerstone in the fantasy genre. You've seen them around. They have other little halfling cousins. They're really the small, smart, intelligent kind of tinkerers, magical users. They're usually around in almost everything. Personally, they tend to grate on my nerves a lot, and just, thematically. Obviously, my personal bias I do my best to make sure they don't affect any of the people playing them in my parties or in games that I'm involved in, because it would just be a horrible thing to do. But personally, they just annoy me. That being said, the gnome has been with D&D since forever, and they're actually a very powerful race, and part of that is a big issue for me, especially considering I like playing other species, but we'll get into that a little later. First and foremost, a little bit about their lore. They came from gems in the earth, at least according to 5E, or maybe even an earlier version. But they were found by the kobolds when they were mining, and then these gems just kind of birthed the gnome species. And the kobolds and gnomes have been at war ever since, which I think is pretty great, because I happen to love kobolds, so I have an invested interest in what happens with this war. But outside of that, there is just nothing about the gnomes that happens to appease me. I'm not gonna make this video a whole downer, but a big part of the reasons why I dislike the small species as an overarching concept tend to stem directly from my dislike for gnomes. In the player's handbook, there's a couple of different options to choose from. You have the forest and the rock gnome, and then in Aberrant you have the mark of scribing, which is something that you can take. We're not really going to cover that because Aberrant is kind of this whole big thing, and all these marks that you can choose kind of replace your special abilities or racial abilities. So that is different, vary for each one, and it's a whole bunch of things to choose from that we're going to kind of just leave off to the side. At one point I'm going to do an Aberrant video and just kind of cover up a lot of the concepts and kind of wrap it up in a nice little bow so people can understand, because it's really, really difficult. But Player's Handbook Gnome has a base and then two options that kind of give you additional abilities. So your first base of the gnome is dark vision, which is great. You have a 25 feet walking speed, because again, you're a small size species, and they kind of do that to limit how fast you can go, because it kind of makes sense. Your legs are a little small for you to cover a bigger distance. It's kind of a little wonky of an idea. I think later on they kind of get rid of this, but in the current status it's still around, so just be mindful you don't move as fast as everyone else. Again, you're 3 to 4 feet tall and weigh around 40 pounds. You're kind of like a child, which is woefully annoying. But the real issue I have in 5e specifically is that they have gnome cunning. And gnome cunning gives you advantage on all intelligence, wisdom, and charisma saves against magic. Now, the two most popular saves you'll probably have to make are dexterity and wisdom. That generally covers a huge amount of magical spells and damage, then followed by constitution. A lot of the necromancy spells tend to be con saves, but nobody bats an eyelash at this ability. No DMs run to ban it. Nobody bans gnomes. Nobody has any issues with anybody playing gnomes. In a heavy role-playing campaign, you expect a lot of charms and magical effects that distort your senses, which all are wisdom saves. Outside of charms, some charms can be charisma saves, well, very few and far between. So they have this plethora that covers a huge area of ability scores in regards to magical resistances. But species that have magical resistance, you have such an uphill battle with your DMs in order to be able to be allowed to play them. But you get so much of that just from the gnome cunning right off the bat. And again, nobody bats an eyelash. And I think it's because personally I think they're the worst. So maybe people are just like, yeah, if you want to play a gnome, go ahead. Yeah, no one's really going to care too much that you have this ability. But it comes up often. It comes up a lot. And it's just a weird thing that's kind of like a social development as the game has been released. But that's just a big issue that I personally have. One of the subspecies or subraces of the gnome is the forest gnome. And the forest gnome is a little bit more kind of dexterous, roguish. You might see a lot of arcane tricksters pick this particular subrace or subspecies, where they, in the world when they used to give you static ability score increases, this would give you a dexterity of +1, and then you would get an intelligence of 2 from being a gnome. So that was kind of the offset here. But you did get 2 abilities. One was Natural Illusionist. You know, the minor illusion cantrip, and intelligence is your spellcasting modifier for it. Minor illusion is a complicated ability to use. It depends a lot on how your DM uses and understands illusions. A DM that is pro illusion and very for their uses will allocate a grander purpose of them in your game and in your world, and I feel like that's the correct attitude to have, because illusions and fantasy kind of go hand in hand. It's a personal bias. They are hard to control the scope and spec of power, because illusions can absolutely crush a campaign very simply, and it has to do with being able to overpower the senses and the ideas of what's going on. Like someone with the actor feat standing inside of an illusion where you're kind of hidden inside the actual image that you're projecting could do devastating damage to a population. Say you're up against an army, and then you set up this apparition of a god and use the silent image so you can make it move, but you can't make it speak, but you sit inside of it and you speak for it. Now you're a god of war telling this army that they are in the wrong spot and that this is not the war that's to be fought. And if they do fight, they will not have your support and they will die and lose vast amounts of numbers. You can seriously demoralize and hurt that whole circumstance. Again, it has that kind of scope of power where you can greatly influence things. Not easy. It does take a lot of guts. If that fails, is that a fun backfire? Absolutely. But things like minor illusion can have very great impact. Treant Monk does a great video about the scope of power that minor illusion does give you, and it's just about minor illusion, so you can see what the cantrip is really capable of. And Treant Monk has a wonderful mind for those kinds of concepts and those understandings. After you watch that video, it really changes your perspective. This is a little bit of a rant about illusion, but it is a greater cantrip than I believe it gets credit for. And the gnome gets this if it's a forest gnome. The other ability a forest gnome gets is called Speak with Beasts. Through sound and gestures, you may communicate simple ideas with small or smaller beasts. They are kind of like Aquaman, but with tiny animals. So yeah, you find a spider, you can make it dance for you or whatever it is. The more creative of a player, the more you can do. You can have a squirrel carry a message to you. That's a very simple idea, especially if you can see the person it's supposed to go to. So that way the squirrel, it's not like Animal Messenger, which is a whole different concept. But you can do small little things, but it's super niche. It's a circumstance where you have to have tiny animals around you, and you have to have something that they can actually do feasibly. Most of them do have stats, so you can look around through the monster manual and try and figure out which ones can and cannot help you, and to what extent, but ultimately, not much here for the forest gnome. Finally, they also had the rock gnome. Most of the time you see gnomes, they will probably be rock gnomes. Really, it's because of the offset between the forest as abilities, because the forest really just gives you minor illusion. That's really kind of your biggest benefit there. So the rock gnome, in a world where static ability scores were still in play, gave you a +1 to constitution, which is great if you were a caster like a wizard, which the static ability score of +2 to intelligence kind of indicated you should be. You gain one ability called Artificer's Lore. Whenever you make an intelligence history check related to magic, chemical, or technological items, you can add twice your proficiency bonus instead of any other proficiency bonus that may apply. It's a kind of a weird way to say you have expertise in history, but they kind of worded it in a very unique manner. And the other option you have is Tinker. You are proficient with Artisan's tools, Tinker's tools. Using those tools, you can spend 1 hour and 10 GP worth of materials to construct a tiny clockwork device, an AC of 5 with 1 hit point. This device ceases to function 24 hours unless you spend 1 hour repairing it to keep the device functioning, or when you use an action to dismantle it. At that time, you can reclaim those materials used to create it, and you can have up to 3 such devices at a time. When you create a device, choose one of the following options. Clockwork Toy. This toy is a clockwork animal, monster, or person, such as a frog, mouse, bird, dragon, or soldier. When placed on the ground, the toy moves 5 feet across the ground on each of your turns in a random direction. It makes noises as appropriate to the creature it represents. Firestarter. This device produces a miniature flame, which you can use to light a candle, torch, or campfire. Using the device requires your action. A music box. When open, this music box plays a single song or at a moderate volume. The box stops playing when it reaches the song's end or when it is closed. And then at your DM's discretion, you can make other objects with effects similar to power of these. The prestidigitation cantrip is a good baseline for such effects. Again, there isn't really a lot overall that you get from the subspecies of being a gnome. The caveat here is when you had static ability scores, picking the one that better suited your circumstance. Tinker can be fun. It can be useful as far as having something out in the wilderness. Could always start a fire. Depending on what kind of character you are, circumstance might require you to use something like that. And it's a cool little thing just to show people in town, just to garner favor with someone. It's like, look, I've made this. It's cool. It's funny. It doesn't really do much, but it might bring you joy as a gift to give someone or something. A nice way to put that ability into some sort of roleplay use is always a good thing, because tiny little gifts and things like that can easily change someone's opinion on you, especially on the first time you're meeting someone. Artificer's Lore is surprisingly useful. I'll be honest with you, there's plenty of times when you're in caves and dungeons and you're looking around trying to understand what's going on. Having expertise in that makes a big difference. My personal biases aside, I don't tend to see gnomes very often in games. It's usually pretty much a rarity to see them, and I think it's because as new species and races get released, a lot of the original ones tend to go under the radar. Being small, I've seen some videos where it gained a really tactical advantage, or some people trying to explain that kind of avenue for it. I don't get that. I feel like whether you're small or medium sized doesn't really affect your gameplay that much. Small, being able to move in between larger monsters or whatever, and just it doesn't seem to produce the tactical advantage that I believe some people believe it does. But if you want to play a small race, that's fine. I tend to see a lot of DMs who allocate small races to be able to overcome their normal circumstances, where they give them the 30-foot move speed, or they don't regulate it when they see it being broken, or they let them use heavy weapons and things like that. But the whole caveat is, if you pick something that has this constriction to it, if you remove it, is that still the same thing it was before? And a lot of times it's not. In a game where you do a lot of combat and tactics being involved, having a unit that's supposed to do one thing not have those restrictions makes it a different thing altogether. And I feel like you kind of lose the flavor of it, because what was the point originally if you're just not going to live within the confines of being that kind of a character? If you're small as a creature type, then overcoming those things due to your size should be somewhat important to your character. And I see one of the things I see more often than I thought I ever would is when people play characters and they put these own restrictions on their characters because of their own backstory reasons, or who the character was, or maybe they dived really deep into the lore and there's certain apprehension towards certain things, and restrict their character from doing them as a result of that. And yeah, it makes the game harder. You now have more regulations to deal with, but I've always found that players that are willing to go that far always ended up with a character that had more meaning, and it was really a unique way to kind of, make the game more challenging for yourself and make your character a little bit more interesting than it would have been. With all that said and done, we're going to bring this video to a close. If you made it this far, thank you so much. Definitely hit that like and subscribe button. A big thank you to our Patreon supporters. We love you guys. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. If you're interested in becoming a Patreon supporter, definitely check out the link in the description. And a big thank you to our good friends at Critical Failures. We're part of a game there with some incredible players. Check us out Wednesdays about 9:30. All the videos are uploaded the next day, so you can catch up whenever you want. And thank you for giving a spooky kid a chance.